Good afternoon. Thank you very much, Darius, for the introduction. I think you may have heard me speak before. I'm Craig Davies from the EBRD, and I've been asked to speak about the subject of metrics for climate resilience. And I think we've already heard today and yesterday this subject of metrics mentioned on many occasions. It's a subject that is attracting quite a lot of attention. There are many parties talking about metrics. We know that there's work going on within the development finance community. We know that the climate finance mechanisms, the GEF, the GCF, and others, they also have developed their own internal systems for measuring results of climate resilience projects. But we know that there's a lot of action going on in the private sector. So we heard this morning from Standard & Poor's, which is a leading global ratings agency, about the work that they're doing to develop metrics. We've seen at COP22 very timely thought leadership from the Moroccan authorities. There was a conference in September last year here in Morocco, just before COP22, that was very informative in terms of stimulating the debate around climate resilience metrics. So why do these metrics matter? Well, you know, there's an old mantra that if you can measure something, you can manage something, which applies to all kinds of walks of life. And I think we're now beginning to see in the climate resilience debate that we really do have a need for having a clearer understanding on how we can measure the results of what we're doing. It's all very well having good processes. It's all very well having good guidance. It's great to have emerging standards. These are all going to be very useful. But if we don't have metrics, then we can't measure the progress towards any of these things. And I want to sort of lead you or talk you through a bit of a breakdown in terms of the different types of metrics that we can consider. So some of you, to help me do this, I'm going to refer to the report of the Task Force on Climate Risk Disclosure that some of you may have read. It came out a little bit earlier this year. And it paid great attention to the role of metrics. It didn't go into great detail, but it did make a very important point that much, much more work is needed on metrics for helping us work out how to use finance more effectively in responding to the climate change challenge. It distinguished between two big groups of risks, climate risks. It distinguished between what you might call carbon transition risks and physical climate risks. So by carbon transition risks, I mean the risks to businesses, to governments, to other actors, if they don't keep up with the pace of decarbonizing the global economy. Okay, stranded assets, people who are left behind because they continue using fossil fuels when the rest of the world is moving on. But today we're not going to talk about that because we're talking about climate resilience. So that means that we're interested in the other category, which is physical climate risks. How the risks that are associated with a more variable and changing climate, which, as you know, they can manifest themselves in many different ways. The task force report went one step further, and so, for example, it differentiated physical climate risks between, in terms of metrics, it differentiated between risk metrics, so the metrics that we can use to measure risk, and then opportunity metrics, so the metrics that we can use to measure the benefits or the positive outcomes of climate resilient actions. Now, in plenary 2 upstairs at the moment, Jessica Williams from Standard & Poor's is talking in more detail about the Task Force on Climate Risk Disclosure. And John Firth is representing the Global Adaptation and Resilience Initiative, GARI. And he is talking upstairs just now about metrics for physical climate risks. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on the topic of metrics for expressing the benefits of climate resilience interventions and projects. And I'm going to refer to work that's being carried out by the multilateral development banks, so that's EBRD, but also the World Bank Group, African Development Bank, Asian Development Bank, Inter-American Development Bank, European Investment Bank, because we're working together to come up with some principles for metrics that we can use to express the benefits of climate resilient investments and projects. So why do we need to do this? Well, I think one of the reasons why we need to do this is that we're now starting to see large amounts of money being committed to climate change adaptation. So in the case of EBRD, I think you saw yesterday, we have already committed more than 1.3 billion euros as adaptation finance over the last 5 years. That figure is much, much larger for the whole family of multilateral development banks. So, for example, last year, the multilateral development banks reported that they had committed $6 billion as climate change adaptation finance. And that figure is then even much bigger when you look at the whole family of development finance institutions. And so what we are finding is that we're reaching a point where people are saying, hang on a minute, you're saying that you're committing all of this money for climate change adaptation, but what are the results? How can you measure the results? And if you're saying that you're making a project more climate resilient, how do you measure whether you've made it more resilient? So that's what we're trying to do in the MDB work, is to come up with some basic principles for a system that enables us to express the outcome or the results of our climate resilience investments. Now, I need to work out how to use the keyboard. It works. Good. Okay, so let's run through a few things. And when we started working on this topic, we looked across at our colleagues who work on mitigation. And we thought to ourselves, okay, well, inputs, we have metrics for measuring the inputs, both for adaptation and mitigation. We can measure the inputs in monetary terms. We have established methodologies for measuring and tracking how much money we commit for adaptation and for mitigation. And in the case of the multilateral development banks, every year we publish a joint climate finance report where we report how much money we are committing for adaptation and for mitigation. Okay, and then when it comes to the outcomes, well, with mitigation, we do have some robust and well understood and well recognized metrics for reporting the outcome of mitigation projects. Perhaps the best known one of those metrics is tons of CO2 equivalent. So, for example, we MDBs, when we report a climate change mitigation project, we always estimate the estimated reduction in greenhouse gas emissions that a given project will deliver. And that's a very useful metric because it's comparable between different sectors. It enables us to compare a wind farm with the modernization of a cement plant, with an afforestation project. We can compare totally different projects in different sectors in terms of what impact do they deliver in terms of reducing emissions. They're also aggregatable, which means that we can add them together. And that's very useful for a bank or for a financing institution because we can then look at our whole portfolio and we can calculate and report how much greenhouse gas emission reduction is our entire portfolio delivering. It can then be a policy tool because then you can work out which projects are giving me the most bang for the buck, which projects are enabling me to make the biggest contribution to reducing emissions per dollar. Now, how do we do that for adaptation? Can we ever do that for adaptation? And this is the difficult question that we've been trying to address in the MDB group. And one of the challenges that we have is that adaptation is highly context-specific. So adaptation requires different approaches and different solutions in different contexts. It matters where you are, which country you're in. The specific micro-location of the project matters. Are you in a coastal location? Are you in a floodplain? Is your project in a location that's vulnerable to soil erosion or landslides or flooding? It's also sector specific. So we heard this afternoon that ports are inherently exposed to climate risks. Other sectors may be exposed to other types of climate risks in a way that's quite specific to what they do. And that means that we can come up with metrics at the project level or the sector level, but we can't aggregate them. And it makes it very difficult using those kinds of project-specific metrics or sector-specific metrics. It makes it very difficult to compare a port with a hydropower plant with an afforestation project. It makes it very difficult to compare these projects. So is it possible to have cross-sector metrics for adaptation, the kind of metrics that enable us to compare totally different projects in totally different sectors, and to have some kind of measure as to how they compare with each other in terms of their contribution towards climate resilience? And this is work that is going on in the MDB group. Before I go further, I want to stress it's a work in progress. We haven't finalized this work yet. We hope that by the time of COP23 in November, we hope to be at a point where we'll be ready to share this work and its findings with the wider community through a side event. So please bear that in mind, that I'm only able to discuss certain aspects of this work because it's not finalized yet. So what we've done within EBRD's contribution to this group is we've tried to tackle this question of how do we cope with the difference between project-specific metrics and universal cross-sector metrics by taking a kind of a two-tiered approach. And what we did is we have listened and consulted to a very wide range of organizations. We've talked to other development finance institutions. We've talked to commercial banks and commercial finance institutions. We've talked to ratings agencies. We've talked to civil society. We've talked to think tanks and academia in helping us to work out a way forward. So one of the ideas that we've taken is something that Jessica talked about this morning, which is Standard & Poor's work. And we've particularly looked at their climate resilience benefit, which is something that Jessica spoke about in her presentation this morning. And what we've done to try to apply that is that we've said, well, let's see if we can have two tiers. For every project that we report, let's see if we can have a physical tier, and the physical tier can be expressed using project-specific metrics that are tailored for the individual project. And then let's see if we can have a kind of valorized or monetized tier, okay, which is based on the physical climate resilience outcome. And let's see if we can use that to calculate a kind of climate resilience benefit that enables us to make some kind of cross-sector comparison between different projects. Before I go further, I want to say that there's been quite a bit of diversity in the views across the people that we've consulted on what should be the common denominator for these cross-sector metrics. Should it be monetary? Now, some people that we've spoken to, some people within our group believe that a monetary basis is the most appropriate common currency, if you like, for how you can compare different projects. But there are different perspectives. Some people think that it should be people-based. So the number of people who benefit from a climate resilience project, that a people-based approach is the more appropriate common denominator for comparing between projects. And another perspective is that it should be ecologically or environmentally based. So there could be ecological outcomes like preservation of biodiversity or acres of habitat that's protected. So there's a difference of views in exactly what these common denominators for cross-sector metrics should be. But I'm going to show you some work that we've done on two projects where we have tried to apply this methodology, and I stress that this is a work in progress. These are just exploratory examples of how we've tried to apply this methodology. So very quickly, the first example is an irrigation upgrade project in southern Kazakhstan. This is a part of the world that's experiencing very severe water stress and increasing water stress. I'm sure many of you know about the shrinking and, sadly, possibly the disappearance of the Aral Sea. Well, this is a part of the world where really difficult issues around water resources is contributing to that problem. And what we did in this project is that we tried to quantify the climate resilience benefit of this investment. So this was a modernization and an upgrade of an irrigation system that was very, very inefficient in its use of water. Huge amounts of water are being lost in the conveyance of water in this system. So, in other words, the long system of canals and pipes that brings the water from the source to the farmland is extremely inefficient. And through our upgrade of the project, we estimated through our feasibility study that we could help South Kazakhstan to achieve enormous water savings by reducing vast amounts of water leakage. And you can see that the physical outcome that we identified for this project was a reduction in water conveyance losses of 180 million cubic meters per year. So a vast amount of water savings. So that's what we consider to be the physical climate resilience outcome of the project. Then what we've done is we've aimed to valorize those water savings. What's the value of those savings? What are they worth? Now, what we've done there is that we've been very careful to use a shadow water price, because often, as you know, in many countries, water prices are highly distorted. They're often subsidized, or they're often set at a level that does not reflect the true value of the water. And we've used a methodology to apply a shadow water price that enables us to estimate what that water is worth to the population, taking into account all of the externalities, the environmental costs of using the water, and the resource costs of using the water. And that's enabled us to estimate an annual valorized figure of $35 million per year. And that's what we estimate as being the value of the water that's saved, the value of the physical climate resilience outcome for that project. And then what we've done to kind of estimate the climate resilience benefit is that we've projected over the lifespan of the assets that we're financing, what will that benefit, what will be the cumulative benefit of that project over the lifespan of the investment. So in this case, the infrastructure is expected to last for 25 years. So that means that we've arrived at a figure of $887 million as being the climate resilient benefit delivered by that project. Now, I want to stress that this is very unofficial, exploratory work that we're doing as part of our analysis, but it's just an illustration of some of the thinking that's going on in terms of how we can quantify climate resilience outcomes, how we can use them in order to explain to our board, to our shareholders, what we are doing with their money and how their money is being used to deliver climate resilience benefits that can be quantified. We also think that metrics like these could be extremely important for mobilizing greater private sector action on climate resilience, because at the moment, what people often find when they talk to businesses about climate risk is that private investors and businesses say, well, I can't sell risk. I need a positive. I need to be able to demonstrate a benefit. I need to be able to demonstrate an opportunity. So we think that these kinds of metrics where we are able to express the climate resilient benefit could also be useful for leveraging, for mobilizing, and for building a business case as to why climate resilience it can deliver benefits and what those benefits are and how we can quantify them. If we're going over time, I can pause there.
Take another minute.
Okay, so if I've got one more minute, I'm going to show you one more example, which is the last slide, which is the same process, but we've applied it to a different kind of project. This is a project in Egypt where we were helping a power generator move from a water-cooled to an air-cooled system. The reason for that was that in this particular location in Egypt, access to water was a real problem for water-cooled thermal power generation. And this was a case where the water-cooled, it was a gas turbine power station, interruptions in the access to water for cooling the system was making the system really unreliable and resulting in multiple closures of the power station per year. So our investment was intended to help them switch from a water-cooled system to an air-cooled system, which means they could generate electricity with using hardly any water. Okay? So what's the value? What's the climate resilience benefit of that investment? Well, we estimate that there are two physical outcomes. One is that, firstly, the system's not using cooling water, so the water consumption is being reduced basically down to zero. And the second is that the disruption has been reduced, that the disruption in the power supply is going to be reduced because we no longer have the problem of power supply interruption due to insufficient cooling water. So you can see from the table that we estimated that the cooling water consumption, the water consumption, would be reduced by 100 100 million cubic meters per year. And we estimated that there would be a reduction in the number of down days from 15 to 0. And then we were able to valorize, or estimate the valorization, again using a shadow water price. So we estimated that the value of the water savings was about $27 million per year. And obviously, when you're a down day of power supply implies a huge cost to the population. You know, that's a day without power. And if you think about the cost that implies for businesses, for households, it's a very high figure. So we estimated that by reducing the number of down days from 15 to 0, that had a very high value. And we valorized that at $216 million per year. And that means that, you know, that leads us to a very high climate resilience benefit. I stress these are all estimated figures using a methodology that's still in its design phase. But it led us to a climate resilience benefit of, you know, $6 billion US, which is a very large figure. But I think if you look at these two examples, it gives a sense of one way, it's not the only way, but it's one way in which we can start to quantify climate resilience benefits and valorize them so that we can then have some mechanism for expressing to financial institutions what impact, what value, what benefit their investments are delivering. So I'll pause there. I'm happy to take questions afterwards. I just want to stress that we're not saying this is the only way. We're saying it's a way that we want to develop further. And we're certainly, it's very much open for consultation at this point because it's a work in progress, so feedback is very welcome. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Craig. I'm not sure if you noticed, but the last slide you had was Egypt on the screen and Kazakhstan on this big screen. So if you want to see the Egypt example, please look online and see the cost-benefit analysis now in the form of resilience benefits, a fantastic new methodology. Now today is the 9th, is that right? 7th of September. We should circle this date. And we should circle this date in our calendars because it was the second day of the SCF forum. But the other reason why we should circle this date is because it's the first time I've seen this since I've been looking in this, the financial sector. Today, there's a publication called The Banker. The Banker was founded in 1926. It's almost 100 years old. And they've run a cover story where the editor, who's been in the business for as long as he could be, writes an editorial, says, "It's the environment, stupid." Now, The Banker is a conservative publication. This is what the UK bankers and the US bankers read to know what they should think about their business. And today he writes this. He says, under clean energy scenarios, oil majors become rather less blue chip to lend to than those engaged in the technologies of the future. For example, renewable energy, electric cars, and insulation. In these sectors, there are big opportunities, with one estimate putting the investment needed to transition to a lower carbon economy at $1 trillion each year for the foreseeable future. All this provides huge challenges to banks' risk departments. They need models for vastly different scenarios. At one end of the scale, natural disasters cause massive economic damage. At the other, the economy is completely restructured with many loans going bad. Time for risk managers to go into a huddle and stay there for a long time. This is not Greenpeace. This is the trade magazine that bankers read. So on the 7th of September, 2017, we can begin to see one more shift in the landscape of the finance sector.